Margaret O'Sullivan pressed her face against the dusty train window, watching the endless Texas plains roll by. The year was 1887, and every mile took her further from everything she had ever known. Boston felt like a different world now, with its brick buildings, busy streets, and familiar faces. Out here, there was nothing but grass, sky, and the occasional lonely farmhouse. She clutched the 3 letters in her worn leather bag. 3 letters from Thomas Whitman, a cattle rancher who had promised her a new life. The first letter had arrived at the boarding house where she worked as a seamstress. Margaret had been mending torn sheets when Mrs. Patterson, the landlady, handed her the envelope with a curious look. "Mail for you, dear, from way out west." Margaret's hands had trembled as she opened it. A man looking for a wife. A respectable woman to share his ranch and help build a future. The letter was polite, well-written, and spoke of wide open spaces and fresh starts. For a 24-year-old Irish woman with no family and few prospects, it sounded like a dream. The second letter had contained more details about his ranch and the small town nearby. He wrote about cattle, good soil, and neighbors who helped each other through tough times. He even mentioned a little church where they could be properly married. Margaret had written back, telling him about her skills with a needle, her education at the convent, and her willingness to work hard. The third letter had been the shortest. Just travel arrangements, money for the train ticket, and instructions to meet him at Prairie Junction. He would be waiting with a wagon, he promised. They would go straight to the preacher and then to his ranch to start their new life together, now. As the train slowed down, Margaret felt butterflies dancing in her stomach. What would he look like? Would he be kind? Would she be able to love him? She had packed her few belongings carefully, 2 dresses, her sewing kit, her mother's rosary, and a small mirror that had belonged to her grandmother. Everything she owned in the world fit in one small bag. The train wheezed and groaned as it came to a stop. Through the window, Margaret saw a small wooden platform and a tiny building that looked like it had seen better days. The paint was peeling, and one of the shutters hung crooked on its hinges. This was Prairie Junction. "End of the line, miss," called the conductor, a kindly man who had checked on her several times during the long journey. "Someone meeting you?" "Yes," Margaret said, smoothing down her best dress. "My future husband." The conductor helped her down from the train with her bag. The platform was empty except for a few wooden crates and a water barrel. Margaret looked around, expecting to see a man with a wagon, but there was no one in sight. "He'll be along," she told herself, watching as the conductor loaded mail bags and checked his pocket watch. The train only stayed for 10 minutes. As it pulled away, black smoke puffing from its chimney, Margaret found herself completely alone. The sound of the engine faded into the distance. Leaving only the whisper of wind through the tall grass dot, she walked over to the small station building and tried the door. It was unlocked, which seemed like a good sign. Inside, there was a wooden bench, a cold pot-bellied stove, and a counter where someone must have once sold tickets. Everything was covered in dust. It looked like no one had been there in months. Margaret sat on the bench and waited. Maybe Thomas had been delayed. Maybe one of his cattle had gotten sick, or he had trouble with his wagon. She tried to stay positive, but as the sun moved across the sky, worry began to creep in. An hour passed. Then, too, the afternoon sun was getting hot, and Margaret was grateful for the shade of the little building. She opened her bag and took out a piece of bread she had saved from breakfast on the train. She ate it slowly, trying to make it last. As evening approached, Margaret began to feel truly frightened. Where was Thomas? Had something terrible happened to him? Or worse, had he changed his mind about marrying her? Maybe he had seen her get off the train and decided she wasn't what he expected. The thought made her cheeks burn with shame. Walked outside and looked in every direction. To the north she could see what might be smoke from a chimney, but it was very far away. To the south there was nothing but grass and a few scattered trees. The road that led away from the station was just 2 dusty tracks that disappeared over a hill. Night was coming fast. Margaret had never seen such a big sky, with stars that seemed close enough to touch. But instead of being beautiful, it felt scary and empty. In Boston, there were always lights in windows, people walking by, the sound of horses and carriages. Here, there was only silence and the distant howl of what sounded like wild dogs. She went back inside the station building and tried to make herself comfortable on the hard bench. She used her extra dress as a pillow and pulled her shawl tight around her shoulders. Every little sound made her jump, the creak of old wood, the scurry of a mouse, the rustle of something outside the window. Margaret had never spent a night alone in her life. At the convent school, she had shared a room with other girls. At the boarding house in Boston, there were always people around, other workers, guests, Mrs. Patterson checking on everyone. Now, in this abandoned place, she felt more alone than she had ever imagined possible. She thought about her journey from Boston. 3 days on the train, watching the country change from green hills to flat farmland to this endless grass prairie. She had been so excited, so full of hope. Now she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. What if Thomas Whitman didn't exist at all? What if the whole thing had been some kind of cruel joke? She had heard stories of people who took advantage, of others who promised things they never intended to deliver. Maybe someone had collected her train fare and never planned to marry her at all. The night seemed to last forever. Margaret dozed fitfully, waking every time she heard a sound. Once, she was sure she heard footsteps outside, but when she looked through the window, there was nothing but moonlight on the empty platform. As the first light of dawn crept through the dusty windows, Margaret realized that her new life was not going to be anything like she had imagined. Instead of a wedding and a warm home, she was stranded in the middle of nowhere with no money for a return ticket and no idea what to do next. She had come west looking for love and security. Instead, she had found abandonment and fear. But Margaret O'Sullivan was stronger than she knew. Her Irish grandmother had always said that the women in their family were like the old oak trees. They bent in the storm, but never broke. As the sun rose over the Texas prairie, Margaret made a decision. She would not give up. She would not sit in this abandoned station and wait to die. Somehow, some way, she would survive this. She had to. The second day at Prairie Junction began with Margaret's stomach growling so loud it echoed in the empty station house. She had eaten the last of her bread the night before, and now all she had left was half a bottle of water she had filled from the pump outside. The metal handle was rusty and squeaked something awful, but the water tasted clean enough. Margaret walked outside and looked at the railroad tracks stretching in both directions until they disappeared into the horizon. According to the schedule she had memorized, another train should come through in 2 days, heading back east. But that train never stopped at Prairie Junction unless someone flagged it down with the big red signal flag that was supposed to be hanging by the platform. The problem was, there was no flag anywhere to be found. She spent the morning searching every inch of the station building and the area around it. In the old ticket office, she found a calendar from 1885, 2 years old. There were spider webs in the corners and mouse droppings on the floor. It was clear that no one had worked here in a very long time. The realization hit her like a punch to the stomach. Thomas Whitman had sent her to a station that wasn't even operating anymore. Either he didn't know, or he had done it on purpose. Neither possibility made her feel any better. By midday, the Texas sun was brutal. Margaret had never experienced heat like this. In Boston, even the hottest summer days had some relief: shade from tall buildings, cool breezes from the harbor. Here, there was nowhere to hide from the sun except inside the stuffy station building, and even that felt like an oven. She tried to stay calm and think practically. Her convent education had taught her to be resourceful. She searched through the abandoned building more carefully and found a few useful things: an old tin cup, some newspapers from 1884 that she could use for kindling if she could find wood, and a rusty knife that might be useful for something. Outside, she discovered that the water pump still worked, even if it took a lot of pumping to get anything out. The water was warm and had a metallic taste, but it was better than nothing. She also found some wild berries growing near a broken-down fence. They were sour and made her mouth pucker, but they were food. That evening, as the sun began to set, Margaret heard something that made her blood run cold. It started as a distant howling, then got louder and closer. She had heard dogs in Boston, but this was different, wilder, more dangerous. She quickly went inside the station and barricaded the door with the wooden bench. The windows had no glass, just wooden shutters that didn't close properly. Through the gaps she could see shapes moving in the darkness. Yellow eyes reflected the moonlight. Coyotes, she had read about them in a book about the American frontier. They were smaller than wolves, but still dangerous, especially if they were hungry. Or if there was a whole pack of them, the animals circled the building for what felt like hours. Margaret sat in the corner, clutching the rusty knife she had found, praying they wouldn't find a way inside. She could hear them sniffing around the building, scratching at the walls, testing the door. Finally, sometime after midnight, they moved on. But Margaret didn't sleep much. Every little sound made her jump. She kept thinking about those yellow eyes and wondering if they would come back. The third day was even worse. The heat was unbearable, and Margaret was running out of water. She had to pump for 20 minutes just to fill her small bottle. Her hands were getting blisters from working the handle, and her back ached from bending over the pump. She was also getting weaker from not eating enough. The berries helped, but they weren't really filling. She tried eating some of the grass, the way she had seen horses do, but it just made her feel sick. Around noon, she saw something that gave her hope. In the distance, there were dark shapes that looked like they might be buildings. Maybe a town, or at least a farm where she could get help. Margaret decided to walk toward them. She filled her water bottle, put on her sunbonnet, and started across the prairie. At first, it didn't seem too far. Maybe a couple of miles at most. But walking on the prairie was nothing like walking on the sidewalks of Boston. The ground was uneven, full of holes and rocks. The grass was taller than it looked from far away, sometimes reaching up to her waist. And her city shoes, fine for cobblestones and wooden floors, were completely wrong for this kind of walking. After an hour, the buildings didn't look any closer. Her feet were hurting, and she was sweating through her dress. The sun seemed to follow her wherever she went, beating down on her head and shoulders. After 2 hours of walking, Margaret realized she had made a terrible mistake. When she turned around to look back at the station, it was just a tiny speck. In the distance, the buildings she was walking toward seemed just as far away as when she started. Worse, she was completely lost. On the prairie, everything looked the same. Grass and sky with no landmarks to guide her. She could walk in circles for hours and never know it. Panic started to set in. What if she couldn't find her way back to the station? At least there had shelter and water. Out here, she had nothing. Margaret forced herself to stop and think. The sun was in the west, which meant if she walked east, she should eventually hit the railroad tracks. Then she could follow them back to the station. The walk back took forever. Her water ran out halfway and her mouth felt like it was full of cotton. Her feet were covered in blisters and every step hurt. By the time she saw the station building again, the sun was setting and she was stumbling with exhaustion. She collapsed on the platform and crawled to the water pump. It took all her remaining strength to work the handle, and when the water finally came out, she stuck her whole head under it, drinking and cooling herself at the same time. That night, lying on the hard bench inside the station, Margaret faced the truth. She was trapped. She couldn't walk to safety. The distances were too great and the terrain too dangerous. She couldn't flag down the train without a signal flag. And she was slowly starving to death. She thought about her life in Boston. It hadn't been easy, long hours sewing in poor light, sharing a cramped room with 2 other girls, never having enough money for anything extra. But at least she had been safe. At least she had known where her next meal was coming from. Now she was hundreds of miles from anyone who cared about her, abandoned by a man she had trusted, slowly dying in a place so remote that her body might never be found. On the 4th morning, Margaret was so weak she could barely stand. She managed to pump some water and pick some berries, but it wasn't enough. She knew she couldn't last much longer. She sat on the platform in the early morning light, looking out at the endless prairie, and tried to make peace with the idea that she might die here. At least she had tried to make something better of her life. At least she had been brave enough to take a chance, Even if it hadn't worked out. As she sat there, feeling sorry for herself and preparing to give up, she heard something that made her heart skip. The soft sound of hoofbeats coming closer. Margaret's heart pounded as the hoofbeats grew louder. She tried to stand up from the platform, but her legs were so weak they almost gave out under her. For a moment, hope fluttered in her chest. Maybe it was Thomas Whitman finally coming to get her. Maybe he had been delayed and was now here to explain everything. But as the rider came into view over the small hill near the station, Margaret knew immediately this wasn't the rancher she had been expecting. The man on horseback was nothing like what she had imagined Thomas Whitman would look like. He rode without a saddle, just a blanket on his horse's back. His hair was long and black, hanging past his shoulders. His skin was bronze from years in the sun, and he wore clothes that were a mix of different styles: leather pants, a cotton shirt that looked like it came from a store, and a vest decorated with small beads that caught the morning light. Margaret had never seen a Native American person before, but she knew that's what he was. In Boston, she had heard stories, some scary tales about wild Indians attacking settlers, and other stories about peaceful tribes who helped travelers. She didn't know which kind this man might be. The rider stopped his horse about 20 feet from the platform. He sat there for a long moment, just looking at her. His eyes were dark and serious, taking in her torn dress, her sunburned face, and the way she was barely able to stand. Margaret tried to speak, but her throat was so dry that only a croak came out. She cleared her throat and tried again. "Please," she whispered, "I need help." The man dismounted from his horse in one smooth motion. He moved carefully, like he didn't want to scare her. When he walked closer, Margaret could see that he was older than she had first thought, maybe in his 30s, with lines around his eyes and a scar on his left cheek. He said something in a language she didn't understand. When she just stared at him, he tried again in English, though his accent was thick and some of the words came out wrong. "You sick? Hurt?" Margaret nodded. "Water," she managed to say, pointing toward the pump, without hesitation. The man walked to the pump and began working the handle. Margaret watched in amazement as he got water flowing much faster than she ever could. He cupped his hands and brought her water to drink, then went back for more. The cool water felt like a miracle. Margaret drank and drank until her stomach hurt, then splashed some on her face and neck. For the first time in days, she felt a little bit human again. "Thank you," she said, and the man nodded. He walked around the station building, looking at everything carefully. He examined the ground near the platform, crouched down to study something in the dirt, and peered through the windows of the abandoned building. Margaret realized he was tracking reading signs that told him a story about what had happened here. When he came back, he was carrying a small leather bag. From it, he took out some dried meat and offered it to her. Margaret hesitated. For just a moment, in Boston, she had been taught not to take food from strangers. But she was starving, and this man had already helped her. She took the meat and bit into it. It was tough and salty, but it was the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. She ate slowly, trying not to make herself sick by eating too fast after. "Going so long without food. What your name?" the man asked, sitting cross-legged on the platform beside her. "Margaret," she said. "Margaret O'Sullivan," he nodded and pointed to himself. "Joseph Running Bear." The name sounded strange to her ears, but she repeated it back to him, and he smiled for the first time since he had arrived. "You wait for someone?" Joseph asked. Margaret felt tears starting to form in her eyes. She told him about Thomas Whitman, about the letters, about coming all the way from Boston to marry a man who had never shown up. The story came out in broken pieces between bites of the dried meat. Joseph listened carefully, asking questions in his careful English. How long had she been here? When was Thomas supposed to meet her? Did she have his letters? Margaret went inside the station and brought back the 3 letters. Joseph couldn't read English very well, but he looked at them anyway, studying the handwriting in the paper. "This man, you know him before letters?" "No," Margaret admitted. "I never met him. He answered an advertisement in a Boston newspaper." Joseph's expression grew serious. He stood up and walked to his horse, which had been patiently waiting nearby. From a pack tied to the animal, he pulled out a rolled-up piece of paper. He brought it back and spread it out on the platform. It was a wanted poster. At the top in big letters it said, "Reward dead or alive." Below that was a drawing of a man's face and a name, Thomas Eugene Whitman. Margaret stared at the poster in shock. "That's him? That's the man who was supposed to marry me?" Joseph nodded grimly. "Bad man, he steal money from many women. Promise marriage, take their money, leave them with nothing." The full horror of her situation began to sink in. She hadn't just been abandoned by a forgetful or delayed rancher. She had been deliberately tricked by a criminal who had probably never intended to marry her at all. "How many women?" she asked. Joseph held up his fingers. 5, maybe 6. I look for him 2 months now. He take money, leave women in bad places, some we find too late. Margaret felt sick, and not just from hunger. Other women had been through this same nightmare. Some of them hadn't been as lucky as she was, if you could call being stranded at an abandoned train station lucky. Are they got? Are the other women? Joseph's face was grim. 2 we find in time. Take them to safe places? 2 others? He shook his head sadly. Margaret understood. 2 other women had died because of Thomas Whitman's lies. She could have been the 3rd. "Why are you here?" She asked. "How did you find me?" Joseph explained that he worked for the railroad company sometimes, tracking down cattle thieves and other criminals. He had been following Thomas Whitman's trail when he spotted signs that someone had been camping at the abandoned station. He had come to investigate and found her instead. "Good thing," he said simply. "You not last much longer." Margaret knew he was right. Another day or 2, and she probably would have died from dehydration and starvation. What happens now? She asked. Joseph looked thoughtful. "You have family back east?" Margaret shook her head. "No family. I worked at a boarding house, but they probably gave my job to someone else by now. You have money for train ticket home?" Again Margaret had to shake her head. She had spent almost everything she had on the ticket to get here. Joseph was quiet for a long time, staring out at the prairie. Finally he spoke again. "I have small cabin near trading post. Not fancy, but safe. You come with me, rest, get strong again. Then we decide what to do." Margaret looked at this man who had appeared out of nowhere to save her life. In Boston, proper ladies didn't go anywhere alone with men they had just met, especially men of a different race. But Boston seemed very far away now, and proper behavior hadn't kept her safe from Thomas Whitman's lies. "Why would you help me?" she asked. Joseph was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My mother was white woman, taken by Comanche when she was young girl. My father could have left her to die, but he saved her. She lived with our people, learned our ways. They had good life together before soldiers came." Margaret understood. Joseph was helping her because someone had once helped his mother in a similar situation. "I don't know anything about living out here," Margaret said. "I'm a city girl. You learn," Joseph said. "You stronger than you think. You survived 4 days here alone. Many people not do that." As Margaret looked at Joseph running bare, she realized her life was about to change in ways she had never imagined. She had come west to marry a rancher and live a conventional frontier life. Instead, she was being rescued by a Comanche tracker, who was offering her shelter and a chance to start over completely. It wasn't what she had planned, but then again, nothing had gone according to plan since she stepped off that train. Maybe it was time to stop planning and start living. Margaret sat on Joseph's horse behind him, holding onto his vest as they rode away from Prairie Junction. Her whole body ached from the days of sleeping on the hard bench, and she was still weak from hunger, but she felt safer than she had in days. The horse moved with a steady rhythm that was almost soothing after the terror of the past week. Joseph's cabin was about 5 miles from the abandoned station, tucked into a small valley with a creek running through it. It was simple but well built, with thick log walls and a stone chimney. Behind it was a small barn and a corral where 2 other horses grazed peacefully. "Not much," Joseph said as he helped her down from the horse, "but it keeps rain out." Margaret looked around. After days in that empty station, any place with 4 walls and a roof looked like a palace to her. "It's wonderful," she said, and meant it. Inside, the cabin was clean and organized. There was a stone fireplace, a wooden table with 2 chairs, shelves lined with supplies, and a narrow bed in one corner. Joseph had clearly lived alone for a long time. Everything had its place, and nothing was wasted. "You sleep there," he said, pointing to the bed. "I sleep outside when weather good or by fire when weather bad." Margaret started to protest. She couldn't take his bed. But Joseph held up his hand. "You sick? You need good rest." "I used to sleeping on ground." Over the next few days, Margaret slowly got her strength back. Joseph brought her food, more of the dried meat, some beans and corn and fresh fish from the creek. She ate carefully at first, afraid of making herself sick, but gradually her appetite returned. Joseph was gone during the days, still tracking Thomas Whitman. Margaret spent the time exploring around the cabin, washing her clothes in the creek, and trying to make herself useful. She mended a tear in Joseph's shirt and reorganized his supplies so they were easier to find. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire and talk. Joseph's English got better the more they spoke, and Margaret learned to understand his way of putting words together. He told her stories about his life, how his white mother had been captured during a raid when she was just 16, how she had learned to live with the Comanche and eventually married his father, a respected warrior. "She teach me white man's language," Joseph said. "Say I need both worlds to survive." Margaret told him about her life in Boston, the long hours in the sewing room, the crowded boarding house, the dreams she had harbored of something better. She also told him about the convent school where she had learned to read and write, and how the nuns had taught her to keep accounts and write letters. "You have good learning," Joseph observed. "Most women out here, they not read or write so good." On the 4th day, Joseph returned to the cabin with troubling news. He had found signs of Thomas Whitman's camp about 20 miles south, but he had also discovered something else, evidence of 2 more women who had been abandoned in remote locations. "One at old mining camp in mountains," he said grimly. "Other at broken-down way station near Rio Grande. Both places, no water, no food, no way to get help." Margaret felt sick. "Are they? Don't know yet. Too far to check and come back same day? But signs are old, maybe 2 weeks, maybe 3. That night, Margaret lay awake thinking about those other women. They had probably received letters just like hers, full of promises and hope. They had probably made the same journey west, carrying the same dreams of a new life and a loving husband. Instead, they had found betrayal and abandonment. The next morning, she made a decision. "I want to help you find them," she told Joseph. He looked surprised. "Too dangerous. Whitman, he bad man. He have gun, he not afraid to use it." "I'm not talking about catching him," Margaret explained. "I'm talking about helping those women, if they're still alive, and helping you catch him by using something he won't expect." Joseph raised an eyebrow, waiting for her to continue. "He answers to women's letters, right? He looks for women who are alone and desperate. What if we use that against him?" Margaret's plan was simple but clever. She would write to Thomas Whitman, pretending to be another lonely woman looking for a husband. She would use a different name and say she was from somewhere far away. When he wrote back with instructions on where to meet him, they would be ready. "I know how he writes," Margaret explained. "I know what kind of promises he makes. I can make myself sound exactly like the kind of woman he looks for." Joseph thought about it for a long time. "Dangerous," he said finally. "If he recognized you." "He's never seen me," Margaret pointed out. "And I can change how I look, different clothes, different hair. You said yourself that some of the women you found were still alive. If we can catch him, we can save others." Joseph had to admit the plan made sense. He had been tracking Whitman for months with little success. The man was clever and careful, always staying one step ahead. But he had one weakness, his greed. He couldn't resist the opportunity to cheat another woman out of her money. Over the next few days, they worked together to plan their trap. Margaret studied the wanted poster carefully, memorizing every detail of Whitman's description. She practiced changing her appearance, braiding her hair differently and wearing some of Joseph's clothes to see how different she could look. Meanwhile, Joseph taught her basic survival skills: how to start a fire, how to find water, how to move quietly through brush. He also showed her how to use a knife for protection, though he hoped she would never need to. Most important thing, he told her, is to trust your feelings. If something feels wrong, it probably is wrong. Don't be brave, be smart. Margaret also helped Joseph with his work in ways he hadn't expected. Her education made her useful for more than just writing letters. When he brought back reports to send to the railroad company, she helped him write them more clearly. When he needed to negotiate with store owners for supplies, she did the talking because some people were more comfortable dealing with a white woman. "You make good partner," Joseph told her one evening as they sat by the fire. "You think different than me, but we think good together." Margaret felt a warm feeling in her chest when he said that. In Boston, she had always felt like she was just getting by, doing what other people told her to do. Here, with Joseph, she felt like she was actually contributing something important. Their partnership was unusual, and they both knew it. A white woman and a Comanche man working together was something most people wouldn't understand or accept. But out here, away from the judgment of civilized society, they were finding that they worked well together. Joseph's tracking skills combined with Margaret's education and knowledge of how Whitman operated made them a formidable team. They were also learning to trust each other in ways that surprised them both. One evening, as Margaret was helping Joseph clean a cut on his hand that he had gotten from barbed wire, she realized something had changed between them. He had saved her life, but now they were saving each other in different ways. She was helping him navigate the white world, while he was teaching her to survive in the wilderness. "Joseph," she said quietly, "what happens after we catch Thomas Whitman?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Don't know," he admitted. "You want to go back east?" Margaret thought about Boston, the crowded boarding house, the long hours bent over a sewing machine, the loneliness of having no family and few friends. Then she looked around the cabin that had become more of a home to her in 2 weeks than any place she had ever lived. "I don't know either," she said, "but I don't think I want to go back to the way things were." Joseph nodded, understanding. "Things change," he said simply. "People change too. Maybe that not bad thing." As they finalized their plans to catch Thomas Whitman, both Margaret and Joseph were beginning to realize that their partnership might last longer than just this one mission. They were discovering that sometimes the best things in life come from the most unexpected places, and that trust and respect could grow between two people who seemed to have nothing in common. The trap was set. Now all they had to do was wait for Thomas Whitman to take the bait. 3 weeks after Margaret had written the letter, the reply came. Joseph rode back to the cabin with an envelope addressed to Miss Catherine Walsh, the fake name Margaret had used. Her hands trembled as she opened it, recognizing the same careful handwriting that had once filled her with hope. Thomas Whitman had taken the bait completely. He wrote about his cattle ranch near Silver Creek, about how lonely he was without a good woman to share his life. He even used some of the same phrases he had written to Margaret months earlier. The man clearly had a system for fooling women, and he wasn't very creative about it. "He wants to meet at Willow Bend Trading Post," Margaret told Joseph. 3 days from now. Joseph knew the place well. It was a small settlement about 30 miles east, where travelers stopped for supplies before heading deeper into the territory. It had a general store, a saloon, and a small inn where people could rent rooms. "Good place for us," Joseph said. "Many people coming and going. Easy to watch without being seen." They spent the next 2 days preparing. Margaret practiced being Catherine Walsh, a shy schoolteacher from Missouri who had never been west before. She braided her hair differently and wore a blue dress that Joseph had bought from a traveling merchant. With a different hairstyle and clothes, she looked like a completely different person. Joseph would pose as her guide, a half-breed tracker hired to protect her on the journey. It wasn't unusual for single women traveling alone to hire protection, and his mixed heritage would explain why he could move easily between the white and Indian worlds. The morning they left for Willow Bend, Margaret felt nervous but determined. Over the past month, she had changed from a frightened city girl into someone who could handle herself in difficult situations. Joseph had taught her well, and she trusted him completely. They arrived at the trading post a day early to scout the area. The settlement was busy with travelers, which was perfect for their plan. Joseph rented a room at the inn for Miss Walsh while he made camp outside town. As would be expected of an Indian guide, Margaret spent the day observing the people who came and went, learning the layout of the buildings, and figuring out the best escape routes if something went wrong. She also checked with the store owner about recent visitors, pretending to ask if any friends from back east might have passed through. "Had a fellow through here a couple weeks back," the store owner told her. Well-dressed man, said he was a rancher, but bought supplies like he was setting up a camp somewhere temporary. Paid with cash, which was nice for a change. Margaret's pulse quickened. That sounded like their man. The next morning, she positioned herself on the porch of the inn, pretending to read a book while watching the road. Joseph was hidden in the woods nearby, close enough to help if needed, but far enough away not to be seen. At exactly 2 o'clock, as promised in his letter, a man rode into town. Margaret recognized him immediately from the wanted poster, though he looked older and meaner than the drawing had suggested. Thomas Whitman was a big man with graying hair and cold blue eyes that seemed to look right through people. He tied his horse outside the inn and walked up to the porch where Margaret was sitting. "Miss Catherine Walsh?" he asked, tipping his hat. "Yes," Margaret replied, keeping her voice soft and nervous the way a sheltered schoolteacher might sound. "Thomas Whitman at your service. I hope your journey wasn't too difficult." Margaret had to fight to keep her expression neutral. This was the man who had left her to die at that abandoned station. This was the man who had probably killed other women with his lies and greed. "Oh, it was quite an adventure," she said. "I've never traveled so far from home before." Whitman smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Well, you're safe now. Why don't we go inside and talk about our future together? I've got so much to tell you about the ranch." As they walked into the inn's small dining room, Margaret caught a glimpse of Joseph moving through the trees behind the building. He was in position. Whitman ordered coffee and started his practice speech about ranch life and the wonderful future they would have together. Margaret played her part perfectly, asking innocent questions and acting impressed by his stories. But she was also listening for information that might help them find the other women. "You must be very successful to own such a large ranch," she said admiringly. "Oh, yes, I've been blessed with good fortune lately," Whitman replied. "Several business ventures have worked out very well for me." Margaret knew he was talking about the money he had stolen from his victims. "I suppose you meet lots of people in your business," she continued, "other ranchers, travelers passing through." "Some," Whitman said carefully, "though I prefer to keep to myself mostly. Can't be too careful these days. Lots of unsavory characters wandering around." The irony of that statement almost made Margaret laugh out loud. After an hour of conversation, Whitman suggested they take a walk to see the countryside where his ranch was supposedly located. This was exactly what Margaret and Joseph had expected. He would lead her somewhere isolated, rob her of whatever money she had, and then abandon her just like he had done to the others. "That sounds lovely," Margaret said, standing up. "Let me just get my traveling bag from my room." "Of course. I'll wait outside with the horses." Margaret went upstairs, but instead of getting her bag, she went to the window that overlooked the back of the building. She waved a small piece of cloth, the signal she and Joseph had agreed on. When she came back downstairs, Whitman was waiting with 2 horses. Her supposed guide was nowhere to be seen, which seemed to make Whitman more relaxed. "Where's your tracker?" he asked. "Oh, I sent him back to town for supplies," Margaret lied smoothly. "I told him I wouldn't need protection with such a strong man as yourself." Whitman's ego clearly enjoyed the compliment. "You're a smart woman, Catherine. I can tell we're going to get along just fine." They rode out of town together, heading toward the hills where Whitman claimed his ranch was located. Margaret tried to memorize the route in case she needed to find her way back alone. After about an hour, Whitman led her to a small clearing beside a creek. There was no ranch anywhere in sight, of course. Just empty wilderness. "We'll rest here," he said, dismounting. "The ranch is just over that next hill." Margaret knew there was no ranch. This was where he planned to rob her and leave her stranded. She dismounted carefully, staying alert for any sudden movements. "It's beautiful country," she said, looking around. "So peaceful and quiet." "It is quiet," Whitman agreed, and his tone had changed. The friendly rancher act was dropping away, replaced by something much colder. Quiet enough that no one can hear you scream. Margaret's heart started pounding, but she kept her voice steady. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" Whitman pulled out a gun and pointed it at her. "I said no one can hear you scream out here. Now, let's see what money you brought with you, Miss Walsh, or should I say Miss O'Sullivan?" Margaret's blood turned to ice. He knew who she was. "That's right," Whitman continued, enjoying her shock. "Did you really think I wouldn't recognize the woman I left at Prairie Junction? You're thinner and your hair is different, but those green eyes are the same. You should have died out there. It would have saved us both a lot of trouble." "How long have you known?" Margaret asked. "Since the moment I saw you on that porch." "But I figured I'd play along and see what game you were running. Where's your Indian friend?" Before Margaret could answer, Joseph's voice came from the trees behind Whitman. "Right here." Whitman spun around, but Joseph was already moving. He tackled the bigger man before he could fire his gun, and they both went down hard. The gun flew out of Whitman's hand and landed in the creek with a splash. The two men fought fiercely. Whitman was bigger, but Joseph was faster and more skilled. Margaret watched in terror as they rolled around on the ground, each trying to get the upper hand. Finally, Joseph managed to pin Whitman down. He tied the man's hands with rope he had brought for exactly this purpose. "It's over, Whitman," Joseph said, breathing hard. "You're going to jail for what you did to those women." Whitman laughed bitterly. "You think anyone's going to believe a half-breed and a lying woman? I've got friends in important places." "Maybe," Joseph said, "but you also got wanted posters with your face on them. And we got evidence of what you did." Over the next few hours, they made Whitman tell them where he had left the other women. 2 of them had been found by other travelers and taken to safety. But 3 others had not been so lucky. Joseph tied Whitman to his horse, and they rode toward the nearest town with a sheriff. It took 2 days to get there, and Whitman complained the whole way. But Margaret didn't feel sorry for him. She thought about the women who had died because of his greed and lies. The sheriff in Millerville knew about the wanted posters and was happy to lock Whitman up. The reward money was enough to give Margaret and Joseph a good start on a new life. They decided to stay in the area, running a small business helping travelers and serving as guides for people who needed to cross the dangerous parts of the territory. Margaret used her education to handle the business side, while Joseph used his tracking skills to keep their clients safe. A year later, they were married in a simple ceremony at the same trading post where they had captured Thomas Whitman. It seemed fitting somehow, the place where her old life had truly ended.